She married the man of her dreams in the spring. By summer, she was gone without a trace. And for 31 years, the only person on earth who refused to believe she had simply walked away into the night was a heartbroken teenage boy who watched his sister disappear from the inside of his own home. This is a story about a small town that thought it had no secrets left to give up. It's about a woman named Clara, a family that never stopped waiting, and a discovery on an early, clunky corner of the internet that finally cracked open a case that everyone else had long since filed away as unsolvable. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why people in that town still lower their voices when they say her name, and why what her brother eventually uncovered was far stranger and far more complicated than anyone could have predicted in 1973. Before we go any further, if stories like this one keep you up at night the way they do for us, this is exactly the kind of case we live for here on Crime Time. Cold Case. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we dig into the cases other channels are too afraid to touch. And trust us, you do not want to miss where this one goes over the next hour and a half. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand what happened to Clara Miller, you first have to understand the world she was living in, because it is almost impossible, looking back from where we sit today, to imagine just how easy it once was for a person to vanish completely. There were no cell phones buzzing in every pocket. There were no security cameras mounted above every doorway and gas station pump. There was no such thing as a digital trail, no bank card pings, no license plate readers, no way to trace a car crossing a state line in the middle of the night. If you wanted to disappear back then, all it took was a full tank of gas and a decision. And if someone else wanted to make you disappear, it was, in a horrifying way, almost effortless. The year was 1973. The place was Millbrook, Ohio, a small, tired steel town that had already seen its best days come and go. The mills still ran, but slower than they used to, and everyone in town could feel the slow, creeping sense that the good years were behind them rather than ahead. Families still got by, but just barely, and it showed in the way people talked, in the way they held on to things a little longer than they needed to, in the quiet pride they took in getting by it all. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where the diner on 5th Street doubled as a town hall, a confessional, and a rumor mill all rolled into one. If something happened in Millbrook, you heard about it at that counter before you heard about it anywhere else, including sometimes before the people involved had even told their own families. And it was in that diner, pouring coffee for tired factory men before their shifts, that a young woman named Clara Miller spent most of her days. Clara was 22 years old that summer. She had long, dark hair that she usually kept pulled back for work, a warm, easy smile, and the kind of gentle patience that made strangers open up to her within minutes of sitting down. Regulars at the diner used to joke that Clara knew more about their lives than their own wives did, and there was more truth to that than any of them probably realized. Men who had just been laid off from the mill would sit at her counter and tell her things they would never say out loud anywhere else, and Clara would simply listen, refill their coffee, and let them feel, for 10 or 15 minutes, like somebody in this world was paying attention. People who knew her back then, and some of them are still alive to tell you this today, describe her the exact same way, even decades later. Kind, a little too trusting for her own good, fiercely, almost stubbornly loyal to the people she loved. That loyalty had been forged early, and it had been forged hard. Clara's father, a man named Walter Miller, had died when she was still a teenager herself, leaving behind a wife and 2 children in a house that suddenly felt twice as large and twice as empty. Walter had worked at the plant his whole adult life, the same plant that half the town depended on, and his death left a hole in that house that no one ever quite managed to fill. Clara's mother, Ruth Miller, did what so many women of that generation did when the floor disappeared out from under them. She went to work, double shifts at the plant, whatever hours she could get, whatever it took to keep the lights on and food on the table. And that left a gap in the household that someone had to fill day in and day out, in ways that a paycheck alone could never cover. That someone was Clara. While she was still a teenager herself, barely out of high school, Clara essentially became the second parent in that house. She made sure her little brother, Thomas, had his homework done before dinner. She cooked the meals when their mother was working late into the evening. She walked him to school on cold mornings and waited up for him on the nights he was allowed to stay out a little later with friends. She protected him in every sense of that word, from the rougher edges of a town that did not always look out for its own kids, the older boys who liked to pick on the smaller ones, the kind of trouble that a 15-year-old without an older sibling watching his back could easily fall into. Thomas was 15 years old in 1973, and if you ask anyone who grew up alongside the two of them, they will tell you that the bond between Clara and her little brother was not an ordinary sibling relationship. It was something closer to a promise. Thomas has said, in interviews given many years later, that Clara was not just his sister. She was the only stable, unshakable thing in his entire world. His rock, in his own words. The one person who had told him, more than once, sitting on the edge of his bed after a bad day, that no matter what happened in her life, she would always look out for him. Hold on to that thought, because that bond, that fierce, protective love between a brother and a sister is the single thread that runs underneath every single thing that happens in this story. It is the reason this case was never allowed to simply fade away, the way so many cold cases from that era eventually do. Because everything changed the moment Richard Evans walked into that diner. It happened in the spring of 1973, just a few months before Clara vanished. A stranger started showing up at the counter, always sitting in the same spot near the window, always ordering the same thing. Black coffee, no cream, no sugar. Richard was 26 years old, sharply dressed in a way that stood out in a mill town where most men wore the same worn-out work clothes day after day. He drove a spotless, gleaming muscle car that turned heads every single time it rolled down Main Street. The kind of car nobody in Millbrook could afford on a factory wage, and he carried himself with a kind of quiet, magnetic confidence that made people assume he must have money, must have connections, must be going somewhere in life that Millbrook, Ohio, simply was not. Nobody quite knew what Richard did for work. Some said he was in sales, traveling through the region for some company nobody could quite name. Others said he had money from his family, old money from somewhere out east. The truth is, nobody in town ever really pinned it down, and looking back now, that alone should have raised more questions than it did at the time. He was smooth. He was polite, almost old-fashioned in his manners. The kind of man who stood up when a woman approached the table and always seemed to have the right thing to say. And he tipped well, which, in a diner full of factory workers counting their pennies, did not go unnoticed by anyone, including the other waitresses who worked alongside Clara. It did not take long before Richard and Clara started seeing each other. On the surface, to almost everyone who watched it unfold, it looked like something out of a storybook. Richard showered her with gifts she had never been able to afford for herself. Small things at first, a scarf, a bottle of perfume, then bigger things as the weeks went on. He took her to restaurants in the city, real tablecloth restaurants, the kind of place a diner waitress from a struggling steel town almost never got to see the inside of. He talked about a future far away from the hardships she had grown up with, a life where she would not have to work double shifts or scrape by, or take care of everyone else for once. He promised, in every way a love-struck 22-year-old wants to hear it, that he was going to take care of her, that she would never have to worry about money or work or anything else again. And Clara, who had spent her entire adult life taking care of everyone else in her family, finally had someone telling her that it was her turn to be looked after. It is not hard to understand why she fell for him as fast and as completely as she did. After years of being the strong one, the responsible one, the one who held everything together, here was a man promising to hold her together instead. But Thomas did not trust him, not even a little. There was something underneath Richard's charm that unsettled Thomas from the very first time he met him, something he could feel long before he could ever put it into words. Whenever Richard came around the small Miller house, he was perfectly polished in front of Ruth. Warm, respectful. He complimented her cooking, asked about her long shifts at the plant, brought small gifts that were exactly thoughtful enough to seem genuine. He was, by every outward appearance, the kind of young man a mother hopes her daughter brings home. But Thomas noticed the smaller things, the things that only show up when you're watching closely and you already have a bad feeling in your gut. He noticed how Richard would talk over Clara mid-sentence, finishing her thoughts for her before she got the chance to finish them herself, always with a smile, always in a way that made it look like affection rather than control. He noticed how Richard's mood shifted almost instantly whenever Clara mentioned spending time with her old friends, the ones she had known since childhood, the ones who had nothing to do with him. There would be a small joke, a light comment about how those old friends were probably holding her back, and slowly, week by week, Clara stopped mentioning them at all. He noticed the brief, cold flicker in Richard's eyes whenever anyone, even in the gentlest way, disagreed with him about anything at all, a flicker that vanished so quickly that if you blinked, you would have missed it entirely. It was subtle, it was fleeting, but it was there every single time if you knew where to look, and Thomas, watching his sister's every move the way protective younger siblings sometimes do, was always looking. Thomas did not have the vocabulary at 15 years old to explain what he was seeing. He did not know the word for controlling. He did not know the word for isolating. All he knew, deep in his stomach, was that something about Richard Evans did not add up, and that his sister was walking straight toward it with her eyes wide open and her heart wide open right alongside them. He tried to warn her more than once. One evening, while Clara stood in front of her bedroom mirror getting ready for another date, Thomas lingered in the doorway, working up the nerve to say what he had been holding back for weeks. He told her, as plainly as a 15-year-old boy can manage, that he did not trust Richard. He asked her if she really, truly knew who this man was underneath all that polish, where he came from, what he actually did all day, why nobody in town seemed to know anything real about him at all. Clara just smiled at him, the same patient, big sister smile she had given him 1,000 times before, and told him he was being overprotective. "He loves me, Tommy," she said softly. "He is going to take care of us. You do not have to worry anymore." There was another moment, weeks later, that Thomas has spoken about since, a moment that has haunted him more than almost anything else from that summer. He and Clara were walking back from the market together, and Thomas brought Richard up again, gently this time, trying a different approach. He asked her what would happen if she ever wanted to leave, if things ever went wrong. Clara laughed it off at first, the way people in love often do when someone questions a relationship they have already decided to believe in completely. But for just a moment, Thomas has said, something flickered across her face, something that looked, if only for a second, like doubt. And then it was gone, and she changed the subject, and neither of them ever brought it up again. It is one of the last conversations Thomas has ever spoken about publicly, and it is one he has said he has replayed in his mind more times than he can count in the decades since, wondering what would have happened if he had pushed harder in that moment, if he had said one more sentence that might have changed everything that came after. Everything after that moved fast, almost too fast. Within a matter of weeks, Richard and Clara were engaged. The proposal, from what family friends remember, happened at one of those fancy restaurants in the city, with a ring far nicer than anything anyone in Millbrook had ever seen up close. Clara came home that night glowing, holding her hand out for her mother to see. And even Ruth, who had her own quiet reservations about how fast things were moving, could not help but be swept up in her daughter's happiness. Within a couple of months after that, they were married in a small ceremony that most of the town attended, because in a place like Millbrook, a wedding was still an event that brought everyone out of their houses, whether they had reservations about the groom or not. The diner closed early that day, so half the staff could attend. Ruth wore her best dress, the one she had saved for special occasions since before Walter passed. Thomas stood near the back of the small church, in a suit that did not quite fit him yet, watching his sister walk down the aisle toward a man he still could not bring himself to trust, no matter how many times he told himself he was simply being a jealous, overprotective younger brother. Clara Miller became Clara Evans that day, and for a brief window of time, it looked, from the outside at least, like she had genuinely found the better life she had been promised. She and Richard moved into a small house on the edge of town, modest by his standards, but a step up from anything Clara had ever had for herself. She reduced her hours at the diner, though she did not quit entirely, something the other waitresses later said seemed strange, given how insistent Richard had always been that she would not need to work once they were married. In the weeks that followed the wedding, people who knew Clara began to notice small changes, The kind of changes that are easy to write off individually, but that add up to something much larger when you look at them together. She stopped coming by her mother's house as often as she always had, without fail, at least once a week since she was old enough to walk there on her own. When she did visit, she seemed distracted, quieter than usual, checking the clock more than she used to. A few of her old friends mentioned, only after the fact, that she had stopped returning phone calls, that when they did manage to catch her, she seemed to be speaking carefully, almost as though she were choosing her words with someone else in mind, even when no one else was in the room. None of it was dramatic enough, on its own, for anyone to raise an alarm. This was, after all, a new bride settling in a married life, and everyone assumed that was all it was. Everyone, that is, except Thomas, who had never once stopped watching Richard with a wary, suspicious eye, and who felt, with each passing week, that the space between himself and his sister was quietly, deliberately widening. Then, in the summer of that same year, she simply stopped showing up. At first, nobody thought much of it. Newlywed life does strange things to people's routines, and Clara had, understandably, cut back on her hours at the diner to settle into married life. Her mother assumed she was simply busy, adjusting, building something new. It was not unusual, in that era, for a young bride to fade a little from her old social circles as she leaned fully into a new household and a new husband, and Ruth, exhausted from her own long shifts at the plant, did not have the energy to read too much into a few missed visits. But weeks turned into a month, and Clara did not call. She did not write. She did not show up at her mother's door the way she always had. And when Ruth finally went to the small house on the edge of town to check on her daughter herself, Richard answered the door alone, telling her, with what she later described as an unsettling calm, that Clara had gone to stay with a cousin for a while to clear her head, that she needed some space, that she would be in touch soon. Ruth, still trusting the young man her daughter had married, accepted this explanation, at least for a little while. Thomas did not. He knew his sister well enough to know that if she had truly needed space, she would have told him herself, would have found some way to reach him, even briefly, even in secret. The silence itself was the loudest warning sign he had, and it was one that nobody around him seemed willing to take seriously yet. By the time police were finally contacted, several more weeks had passed, and the trail, such as it was, had already gone cold. There was no body. There was no note. There was no sign of a struggle at the small home Clara and Richard shared on the edge of town, at least none that investigators could find during their initial walkthrough. When investigators questioned Richard directly, his story was simple, calm, and maddeningly difficult to disprove. He told them that his wife had left him, that she had packed a bag one morning while he was at work and simply walked out, the way unhappy young wives sometimes did back then, and that he had no idea where she had gone or why, though he suggested, more than once, that perhaps married life had simply overwhelmed her, that perhaps she had gotten cold feet about the whole thing and run rather than face him directly. Investigators searched the areas around town. They checked the bus depot records, thin as they were in a town that size. They spoke to neighbors, to Clara's co-workers at the diner, to her old friends who had slowly drifted away over the preceding months. They checked with relatives in nearby cities in case Clara had simply gone to stay with family for a while to sort things out. They found nothing. Not one solid lead, not one piece of physical evidence, not one witness who had seen her leave, not one confirmed sighting anywhere outside of Millbrook. The lead detective on the case at the time, a man whose handwritten notes still exist in the department's archive files, wrote in his own reports that he found Richard Evans cooperative on the surface, but strangely unbothered for a man whose new wife had just vanished. He noted the muscle car had been cleaned unusually thoroughly in the days before police were formally contacted. He noted that Richard changed small details of his story on subsequent interviews, nothing dramatic enough to build a case around, but enough to raise an eyebrow. He noted, too, that in a town where nearly everyone was willing to talk, almost nobody could tell him a single verified fact about where Richard Evans had actually come from before he arrived in Millbrook that spring. But in 1973, in a small town with a small police department and no forensic resources to speak of, a gut feeling was not enough to build a case. Without a body, without physical evidence, Without a confirmed crime scene, there was very little the department could actually do beyond documenting a missing persons report and hoping something eventually turned up. And so the case went exactly where so many cases like it went in 1973. Nowhere. It became a manila folder in the back of a filing cabinet at the local police department, a name that got repeated a little less often at the diner counter with each passing month, a mystery that the town, slowly and almost without meaning to, allowed itself to forget. Richard Evans, remarkably, did not stay in Millbrook much longer after the investigation quietly wound down. Within a year, he had sold the small house on the edge of town and left, telling the few people who still spoke to him that there was nothing left for him in a place that only reminded him of losing his wife. Nobody stopped him. Nobody had any legal grounds to. He simply drove off in that same gleaming muscle car one afternoon, and Millbrook never saw him again. Almost everyone in town eventually moved on. Almost everyone forgot, except for one 15-year-old boy who never once believed, not for a single day, that his sister had simply walked away from the family she loved more than anything else in this world. If you are still watching at this point in the story, do me a favor and drop a comment down below that just says, "I'm still here." It genuinely helps us know how many of you are sticking with these cases all the way through. And honestly, we want to see who is truly following this shocking story before we get any further into it, because everything you have heard so far is only the beginning of what this case eventually turned out to be. For the next 3 decades, Thomas Miller carried a question that nobody else in Millbrook seemed willing to ask out loud anymore. What really happened to his sister? He grew up the way people do, even under the weight of something like this. He finished school, took a job at the same plant his father had once worked at, and eventually started a family of his own, built a life, held down a steady job, the way you are supposed to when the world keeps turning whether you are ready for it or not. He got married in his late 20s, had 2 children, and by every outward measure, built the kind of stable, ordinary life that most people hope for. But every single year on the anniversary of the day his sister disappeared, Thomas would quietly pull out the old case file he had eventually gotten copies of, spread the pages across his kitchen table late at night after his own family had gone to bed, and read through them again, searching for something, anything, that the original investigators might have missed. He would make a phone call to the department, asking the same question he had asked every year before it. Any new leads? And every single year, for 30 years, the answer was the same. No. His mother, Ruth, carried her own version of that grief in silence for the rest of her life. The particular, unresolved kind of grief that comes from never having an answer, never having a grave to visit, never having a single moment of closure to hold on to. She kept Clara's room largely untouched for years after the disappearance, unable to bring herself to pack away her daughter's belongings, as though doing so would be an admission that Clara was truly never coming home. She passed away still not knowing what had truly become of her daughter, still hoping, in some quiet corner of her heart, that maybe, somehow, Clara really had just walked away and started a new life somewhere far from Millbrook, safe and happy, and simply unable, for whatever reason, to come home. Thomas never fully let himself believe that. He could not. Not after everything he had seen in Richard Evans all those years earlier. Not after the cold, controlling flicker in that man's eyes that he had never been able to shake from his memory, even as an adult with children of his own. Over the years, Thomas made a handful of attempts to track Richard Evans down himself, informally, on his own time. He learned, eventually, that Richard had moved through at least 2 other states after leaving Millbrook, working odd sales jobs, never staying anywhere for more than a couple of years at a time. He learned, through old acquaintances and secondhand rumors, that Richard had remarried at least once more, and that the marriage had ended in divorce under circumstances nobody Thomas spoke to seemed willing to describe in detail. Every lead Thomas managed to scrape together on his own led to a dead end, a closed door, a trail gone cold in exactly the same way the original case had gone cold decades earlier. Then, in the early 2000s, something happened that no detective working this case back in 1973 could have ever possibly predicted. The internet arrived, and with it, an entirely new way for the past to resurface. Thomas, now in his mid-40s, started doing something that simply had not been possible for the first 30 years this case sat cold. He started searching public records that were slowly, painstakingly being uploaded and digitized. Old newspaper archives that local libraries were beginning to scan and post online for the very first time. Court records from the various states Richard had passed through, some of which were beginning to appear in early online databases for the first time in history. And eventually, he found his way onto one of the earliest, clunkiest versions of social networking, the kind of website where people from your past, old classmates, old coworkers, old neighbors, were suddenly reappearing online after decades of being completely unreachable. It was a strange, almost surreal experience for a man of his generation, typing a name into a search bar and watching faces from another lifetime appear on a glowing screen. Thomas has said in later interviews that he almost did not know what he was looking for most nights. He would simply search Clara's name, search Richard's name, search anyone connected to that summer in 1973, more out of habit at that point than any real expectation of finding something new. Most nights, nothing came up at all. Some nights, he found small fragments, an old classified ad, a court record listing a divorce filing, a name attached to an address that led nowhere useful when he followed up on it. And then, late one night, scrolling through a barely active, half-forgotten profile buried deep in the results, something on the screen stopped him completely cold. A photograph. A woman, clearly decades older than the last time he had seen his sister, standing in front of a modest house somewhere that the profile did not clearly identify, but with a face that struck him immediately, unmistakably, as familiar. The shape of the eyes, the particular curve of a smile he had grown up watching across a kitchen table his entire childhood. It was tagged, however, under a name he had never once heard before in his entire life. Not Clara Miller, not Clara Evans. A completely different name attached to a completely different life. Thomas has said that he sat in front of that computer screen for nearly an hour that night, staring at the photograph, comparing it in his mind against every memory he had of his sister's face, unable to convince himself it was really her and equally unable to convince himself that it was not. It was not proof. Not yet. A photograph on an old, poorly maintained website was hardly the kind of evidence that could reopen a 30-year-old missing persons case on its own. But for a man who had spent 3 full decades being told there was nothing left to find, it was the very first real thread he had ever been able to pull on. And once he started pulling on it, it did not take long before that single thread began to unravel a secret that Clara's entire family had never, not in their darkest imaginings, seen coming. Thomas spent the following months doing everything within his limited means to confirm what he suspected. He reached out to the person who had posted the photograph, a distant acquaintance of the woman in the picture, and asked careful, roundabout questions about her, where she lived, how long she had been in the area, whether she had any family back in Ohio. The answers he received were vague at first, cautious in a way that only made Thomas more convinced he was onto something real. Eventually, after weeks of careful, patient digging, he managed to get an address. He brought everything he had gathered back to the local police department, the same department that had carried his sister's case for 30 years, and for the first time since 1973, an investigator agreed to take a fresh look. With Thomas's information in hand, and with modern tools that simply had not existed decades earlier, record checks, database searches, and eventually a formal welfare check requested through the department in the woman's current town, investigators were able to do something that no one in 1973 had ever been capable of doing. They found her. The woman living under that unfamiliar name was, in fact, Clara. She had not been murdered. She had not been buried in some unmarked grave the way Thomas had quietly feared for 30 years. Clara Miller had left Millbrook, Ohio in the summer of 1973 entirely on her own, terrified and utterly convinced that if she did not disappear completely, permanently, and without a trace, she would not survive the marriage she had entered into only months earlier. What came out over the following weeks, through careful, sensitive conversations between investigators, Thomas, and Clara herself, was a story far more layered and painful than anyone in Millbrook had ever imagined back when they assumed she had simply run off with cold feet. In the months following her wedding, Clara had discovered, slowly and with growing horror, exactly what kind of man she had married. The charm that had swept her off her feet in the diner had curdled almost immediately once the wedding ring was on her finger. Richard's controlling behavior, the small warning signs Thomas had picked up on from the very beginning, had escalated rapidly behind closed doors in ways Clara had been too afraid and too ashamed to ever tell her family. She discovered, through a chance encounter with a woman from one of the cities Richard used to travel through for work, that she was very likely not the first young woman Richard had done this to, and that at least one previous relationship of his had ended not in a quiet divorce, but in the woman involved disappearing under circumstances that were never fully explained. Terrified for her own safety, and convinced, rightly or wrongly, that going to the police in a small town where Richard was well-liked and well-spoken would not protect her, Clara made the most desperate decision of her life. With help from the same distant acquaintance who would, decades later, unknowingly post a photograph that finally led Thomas to her, Clara left everything behind. Her name, her mother, her little brother, the person she loved more than anyone else in the world. She built an entirely new identity in a state far from Ohio, and she lived every single day afterward believing that reaching out, even once, even briefly, could put her family in danger or bring Richard back in her life in ways she could not survive a second time. She had followed the case quietly, from a distance, over the years, through occasional old newspapers she managed to track down, terrified every single time that Richard might find some way to trace it back to her. She knew her mother had spent decades believing her dead. She knew Thomas had never given up looking, and she carried that knowledge, she has since said, as its own private, unbearable weight for 31 years, believing that her silence, as painful as it was the only thing keeping the people she loved safe. The reunion between Clara and Thomas, when it finally happened, was not the triumphant, easy moment either of them might have imagined as children. It was quiet, careful, and overwhelming. 3 decades of grief and love and unanswered questions compressed into a single afternoon neither of them will ever fully be able to put into words. Thomas has said that the first thing his sister said to him, after 31 years, was almost exactly what she used to tell him as a teenager. "I am sorry, Tommy. I told you I would always look out for you." As for Richard Evans, investigators, working now with far more resources and far more willingness to look closely than existed in 1973, were eventually able to connect him, informally and through pattern rather than formal charges in every case, to at least one other woman who had vanished under strikingly similar circumstances in a different state years after he left Millbrook. Whether he will ever face formal consequences for what happened to Clara, given the decades that have passed and the informal nature of what actually occurred, that she left on her own rather than at his direct hand, remains legally complicated, and is a question the family is still pursuing through the appropriate channels even now. But for Ruth Miller, who passed away years before any of this came to light, there will never be the closure her son eventually found. And for Thomas, the closure he finally received came at the cost of 31 years that can never be given back. 3 decades of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that his sister spent alone, hidden, and afraid, believing that silence was an act of love rather than the tragedy it truly was. This has been the story of Clara Miller, the bride who vanished twice, once into a marriage nobody fully understood, and once into a silence she believed she had no other choice but to keep. If this case has pulled you in the way it pulled us and while we were researching it, please take a second to hit that like button right now. It genuinely is the single biggest way you help a small channel like this one keep telling stories like Clara's. Drop your honest thoughts down in the comments about what you would have done in her position, because we read every single one of them, and these conversations are exactly why we keep doing this. And if you have not already, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are more cases just like this one waiting for you. Cases where the truth turned out to be far stranger and far more human than anyone ever expected. This has been Crime Time, Cold Case. We will see you in the next one.